Welcome back to the Mandarin Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Phil Crimmins, and I'll be running solo today. Flying solo. You don't run solo, you fly solo. And it's because Luke is out of town, but I'll get to that in just a minute. I thought that first we'll talk about some of the updates, what's been going on at Mandarin Blueprint for the past few weeks, what we've been working on. And we'd like to get your feedback on it, of course, because we want to work on the things that matter most to you. So we have been focusing on a number of different things. So I have personally been working a lot on finishing up some of the course material in phases 4 and 5 with our Sichuan University teacher, Annie. Now, Annie is very knowledgeable about how to introduce new grammar points as they become relevant, and also as the characters and words you've learned through the Mandarin Blueprint Method are appropriate to introduce a new grammar point. And we've just finished the important aspects of phase 4. So I figured this is a good time as any to explain the phases for those of you who aren't actually in the course, and as provide a reminder for those of you who are in the course. So phase 1 of the course is all about components and characters. And this is the first 6 levels. It's about the first 46 characters. And what we're saying is not that you don't keep learning components and characters as you move forward, but rather that in phase 1, that's all you should really be focusing on, with the understanding that you already get what pinyin is. Now, if you don't know what pinyin is, then you can take our pronunciation mastery course, but there's also articles even on our own website that explain at least the basics of what the Chinese alphabet is, the romanized version. Now, assuming you know pinyin, you can get started with components, and that's phase 1, which is where we take basic components and use them to build basic characters. Now, we do this through a mnemonic visualization, a patent-pending mnemonic visualization system, but essentially once you get to character 46, we say, okay, phase 2 is started now, and you know how to learn a character, you know how to build it up from the components. You'll keep doing that, but now there's enough characters that it's quite reasonable to start thinking about how 2 characters can combine to create words. And most Chinese words are 2 characters, so you start focusing on vocabulary. So that's levels 7 through 12. Levels 7 through 12 are what you're mostly doing is learning how to take a new word and connect it to your own personal experience. Then, starting at level 13, levels 13 to 20, we start doing sentences and sort of basic grammar, because at that point, you've learned 105 characters, and so you're ready to start putting them together to create simple sentences. And the key to acquiring grammar is actually not to learn grammar points, but rather just get as many sentences as you can that you understand. And it's about quantity. But in order to have a large quantity of sentences, you really have to understand characters and vocabulary properly. So learning any language is accumulative, which means that if you learn how to do a component and character mnemonic scene to learn a character, you keep doing that, but you get better at it as you keep going, and it becomes faster. Then you introduce how to learn a word by connecting it to your own lived experience and finding good images to relate to the word. And you keep doing that, but eventually you get good enough at it that you can start focusing on simple sentences. Now, the next stage, some people would say, well, a sentence by itself, isn't that the language? I mean, aren't you effectively using the language? And it's like, well, yes and no. On the one hand, if you have a sentence that is grammatically correct and you can say it in context, you've succeeded in communicating in the second language. However, it's not as if grammar ends at the level of the sentence. You can move up to the level of the paragraph. So all you would have to do to understand this is imagine how much different a sentence feels if it's in the context of a paragraph or even a couple of paragraphs. When, if you say he had stabbed the man in the heart, if you just see that by itself, it's like, oh no, what a terrible guy. He stabbed him in the heart. But it's like, if you read a whole paragraph that explains that before the guy stabbed somebody else in the heart, he was defending his children. And he was very sad that he had to go to such a, extreme in his self-defense. So the context of the paragraph, the context of the story can change the meaning of the sentence. And if that can change the meaning of the sentence, that means there's grammar, right? Because the function of grammar is to either add content or change the order of content in order to change the meaning, right? So I love you versus do I love you? By adding the do, that changes the meaning entirely. Another example would be they all are not the same versus they are not all the same. The words are the same, they're just put into a different order, so you get a grammatical change. Now, in Chinese, there's no word form changes, which is why the grammar is easier to master, because all you have to figure out essentially is the puzzle pieces of it, the characters and the words connecting. So, phase 4 is when we introduce more and more content to allow for you to see sentences in a larger context. So we'll be making an announcement on the course about how phase 4 works, but essentially what you'll be getting is new short stories, new short opinion pieces, and new longer dialogues that are a bit more back and forth between A and B. Now, that's phase 4. Phase 5 is going to be longer stories. We're still working on that. And so therefore, the final Anki deck of levels 31 to 36 in the current iteration of the course is still in process, but it should be finished within the next couple of weeks after Annie gets back from her spring festival vacation. Now, that's one thing we've been working on. And the plan at the moment is to move on after we finish levels 31 through 36 and finish that content to expanding our character order. Now, this is something that has been a bit of a debate between all of us here at Mandarin Blueprint, because what we're trying to figure out is, would we rather take the course as it is and improve the materials, or would we rather expand the course? And we've come to the conclusion that we think we'd rather expand the course because, as you know, we're big advocates of taking the characters the most seriously of every aspect. So that's to say that the characters are your guiding compass. And so if we're able to expand out the characters to, let's say, HSK 6 level, which might be around 3,000 characters, then that's sort of our foundation, and we can then go back and expand out on what that can create. And luckily, we have a special plan for how we're going to teach vocabulary past level 36, but we'll get to more of that a few months from now, probably. Now, that's the announcement on phase 4. Now we have another bit of news from Mandarin Blueprint that's a bit more happy news and more personal. So the reason why I'm flying solo today and doing the podcast by myself is because Luke is with his girlfriend in her hometown and celebrating Spring Festival. A couple nights ago was the Spring Festival gala, and everybody's at home with their families. They usually eat a lovely dinner. I sure did. And it's a really great time. But a couple of days before, they went to Beijing for a day just to kind of look around. You know, they both have been to Beijing before and wanted to enjoy the sights right before Spring Festival. And Luke went to a place called Jingshan, which is just north of the Forbidden City. It's like right north of the Forbidden City. And Jingshan literally means scenery hill. It's the scenery hill. And shan can mean mountain, but it's definitely not a mountain. It's a hill. And it's actually a man-made hill that's made up of the soil from the moat that surrounds the Forbidden City. So it's kind of cool in that way. And because the center of Beijing is totally flat, it's a really good view of everything around the city. And you can look right down into the Forbidden City. It's quite a good place. And what Luke did there was towards his girlfriend, qiúhūn. And so qiúhūn means to request marriage or to propose. And she said yes. So any of you who are on the course and you'd like to congratulate Luke, leave a little comment on one of the videos. Any video is fine. And or you can just send us an email. I'm sure that Luke will appreciate that. I don't know if he'll listen to this podcast. So Luke is going to get married, and they're great together. It's was a long time coming. I'm very happy for both of them. But I figured it's a good opportunity to talk about hūn, this character, because what he did was qiúhūn, which means to request marriage. Hūn usually means the institution of marriage, you could say. Now, qiú means to request, but to be honest, it's a bit more than just request. If you wanted to make a minor request of somebody, you would actually probably just take the character that means please in Chinese, which is qiúhūn, qiúhūn. And this is just a slightly less intense type of request, And so qiú has a feeling of much stronger request. So it could be maybe a beggar they need food or they're asking for money and they might say, 我求你了. It's a strong request, like, please, I really need this. And of course, you could use 求 if you were begging for mercy or something like that. But they also use it for marriage. But then again, you think about it, of course they would, right? Because it's a pretty heavy request. You're saying, hey, let's get married. Let's spend the rest of our lives together. I think 求 is because it almost seems like if you were to say 结婚 would seem a little bit too diminutive for such a big event. So 求婚 is the first word we're going to learn here. Now the next word we're going to learn that has 婚 is 结婚, and 结 and 求 are both verbs. So you could say 求, what are you requesting? You're requesting or, imploring strongly for marriage. So it's a verb what structure, which is that is to say that like 吃饭 is a verb what structure. You've got 吃, which means to eat. What are you eating? You're eating 饭, a meal. So 吃饭. 求婚 is 求, you're requesting. What are you requesting? You're requesting 婚, marriage. 结 means to tie together or knot together. And of course, in English, we'll say tie the knot to mean get married. So what do you want to tie together? Well, you want to tie together the marriage. So 结婚 means to get married. And so people might say, if they don't know you and they're just meeting you, they might say, 你结婚了吗? Which would mean, have you gotten married? But the thing about it, though, is it is the actual act of getting married. It's not marriage as an institution, which is something that at the beginning I had a little bit of confusion about. But the next word we can learn that has 婚 is what Luke and Nana will be doing the day that they 结婚. So that day when they 结婚, they will have a hūnlǐ, hūnlǐ. And so hūnlǐ is the marriage ceremony. It's the wedding, right? And so lý, that character's third tone, it means ceremony, and it also means it can sometimes mean, things relating to ceremony. Of course, you have other things that are a ceremony that aren't necessarily positive. So it doesn't have a positive or negative because it could be a 葬礼, which would be a funeral. But the 礼 basically refers to some type of ceremony. And what's going to happen that day is a bunch of people are going to give Luke and Nana a bunch of 礼物, which is gifts. So 礼, that same 礼. You put that before 物, which just means thing. Actually, 物 is a very broad character that just means thing or 东西, right? And so that character, 礼物, is like the thing you give at ceremony. So it's gift. Now, after they 结婚 at their 婚礼, they will have a marriage. So if you want to refer to somebody's marriage, or everybody seems to at some point have a little bit of a tough time in their marriage, they might say, 我的婚姻有点问题. I'm having a little trouble with my marriage. You wouldn't say 我的结婚. No. Because that 结婚 is the act of getting married. Once you are married, you have a 婚姻, you have a marriage. So that 因 is the same component as 因为. So that 因 in 因为 is the right side component, but on the left side you have the female component. And so you sort of can see in the characters that most things related to marriage, Chinese people see it as being more focused on the female side of things, and including the institution of marriage itself. Sort of she's the head of the marriage. And then, so that's, you've got 求婚 to request marriage. You've got 结婚 to actually tie the marriage together and get married. You've got the 婚礼, which is the wedding ceremony. And then you've got marriage, 婚姻. Now, of course, this won't happen for Luke and Nana, but suppose that you wanted to leave the marriage and get divorced. That would be líhūn. Now, lý, this character means to leave. You could say 离开, which means to leave something, or, if you go to an airplane booking website, they'll sort of say 离 would mean the departure, and then usually 到 would be the arrival. Now, líhūn is to leave the marriage. So what are you leaving? You're leaving the marriage. So it's the same structure as qiúhūn, jiéhūn, líhūn, and they're all verb what? So lǐ is a verb, it means to leave. What are you leaving? You're leaving the hūn. So of course, this won't happen for Luke and Nana. They're going to have a great hūnyīn for many years, I'm sure, and I'm sure their hūnlǐ will be very beautiful. So thought that would be a good opportunity to teach you guys some words that surround the character hūn. And of course, as I say, if you'd like to congratulate Luke somewhere on the course, please do so. I'm sure he'll be happy to hear it. Now, one final announcement, and then we'll get into today's Q&A, which is that we have 2 new webinars that will be coming out shortly. As a matter of fact, considering that this podcast won't be coming out for about 6 days from now, I can almost guarantee that we'll have the links in the show notes. And by the way, all of those qiúhūn, jiéhūn, hūnlǐ, etc., they are in the show notes as well. Now, these webinars are one is educational and one is just about the Mandarin Blueprint Method. So if you're not on the course and you want to know what the Mandarin Blueprint Method is, we have about a 50-minute webinar that explains the ins and outs of how it works. And we also have about a 1-hour webinar that is meant to just give you some good advice about what you're getting into with Mandarin learning. Like, it's not really a sales webinar. You know, with the Mandarin Blueprint Method, we're explaining what the product is, and so at the end, we'll give you a special webinar offer, so you could say technically it's a sales webinar, but the other one is not meant specifically to sell you anything. Like, we'll give you an offer at the end for the Mandarin Blueprint Method, but the webinar itself is just useful information about the Chinese learning world, what you're facing if you want to learn Chinese. And so those 2 will be available. They're both free. They are pre-recorded webinars because, as you guys know, we're a bit of a small operation here. So running frequent live webinars is not tenable considering all the other things that we have to work on. But as a result of them being pre-recorded webinars, they are quite high quality. So they're higher quality than they could be if they were live. So that's the final announcement. Let's get into the questions. As a reminder, these questions either come from email or they come from the Mandarin Blueprint Method course or our pronunciation mastery course. So sometimes you might have a question that if you're not on the course seems a little bit strange, but if you ever want to try the course, right at the beginning of the show notes, there's a link to the free trial and you can check it out. But it's also worth listening to some of these because many of these questions are applicable whether or not you're on the course. So question number 1 comes from NASEEM SHAWARBA. He's given us a lot of great questions, and he starts off, it's really just actually a bit of a feedback on how he's been doing. So he says, "Thank you very much, Phil and Luke. All my Chinese friends are amazed by how perfect my pronunciation is. They told me I only need to speak a bit faster. I did that, and they told me there's no difference between me and a native speaker." Wow. I am trying to master every initial and final. And what I like about this message from NASEEM, well, first of all, NASEEM, congratulations. That's great. That tells me that you've started off your Mandarin learning journey correctly, which I wish I had. I didn't really focus on pronunciation at the beginning, and that was a mistake. I learned later, I was like, oh, I really should have spent a lot more time on that because I just didn't have good guidance at the beginning. Now, luckily, I had the right bit of advice around characters, and I focused on characters a lot right at the beginning, but I wish I had spent more time on Mandarin pronunciation because at the end of the day, there's only so many syllables. It is possible to master them. And so if you said there's approximately 409, maybe 420, depending on who you ask, syllables in Chinese, but it's not even as difficult as they're all separate because there's only a certain set of initials, there's a certain set of finals, and there's a lot of principles that apply to it. So if you learn the principles of how all the initials and finals work, as NASEEM is working on right now, then you can figure out what the pronunciation is of a given pinyin spelling, a pinyin syllable, without ever needing to practice it necessarily individually. If you understand how the initial is supposed to sound and how the final is supposed to sound, you should be able to say it accurately. And that's why our pronunciation mastery course is a separate course. It doesn't really fit into the integrated system of the Mandarin Blueprint Method because it's finite. I mean, technically speaking, Mandarin as a language is practically infinite. It is because the amount of combinations you could have to create grammatical structures is literally infinite. So technically, the Mandarin Blueprint Method could go on forever. And I suppose if you wanted to get really into the details of pronunciation, you could get, an expanded course. But when it comes to how do you say properly in a way that other Chinese people can understand every single syllable in Chinese, it's a finite process. It doesn't take that long. The pronunciation mastery course is only about 6 hours with about 2 hours of bonus material, but the stuff that's focused specifically on pronunciation is only about 6 hours long. So if you take the pronunciation mastery course, you got it. You got Mandarin pronunciation, which is the best way to start learning any language. So thanks for that feedback, NASEEM. Now, we'll go to the next one, which is a bit more about study motivation. So this is from Chad RESSLER, and he left this comment on our bonus video, The 4 Components of Habit Building Part 2, Routine. And we're big fans of focusing on habits because Mandarin needs to become a daily 0 days off, or you could say no 0 days habit if you want to find success, because there's literally nothing in life, no big project at all, that does not get achieved through incremental improvement. If it's a project that takes a day to do, okay, then you did it in one stroke. But if it takes longer than that, there's no other way around it. You have to have incremental improvement. If you have to have incremental improvement, then the key is to cordon off a part of your day, or even better, cordon off a part of your mind that just says, this is a non-negotiable thing. I'm doing it every day. And so you want to fit it into your routine. So Chad says, Chinese must be integrated into your existing routine or new routine, including it should be established. So my study time is now done with morning coffee, Anki later in the day, and a Mandarin language movie at bedtime. I've seen progress daily with this routine, and that's great. That's different from my routine, but if it works for you, that's what you should do. So, for example, I'm a daily exerciser, and I tried to do it in the morning because I have a number of people who I really admire who get up really early and they work out right away. And I was finding my performance doing it at that time to just be very kind of crap compared to what it would be if I just did it in the afternoon. And so now I do it every day in the afternoon, and it's great. It works very well for me. So you got to find the thing that works for you. And, I used to do Anki first thing in the morning. It looks like for Chad, he'd rather do the learning early in the morning and then do his reviews later in the day. And I can totally see how that would work. And then, of course, a Mandarin bedtime movie is a great way to keep it, right before bed too. So it's like, it's going to be processing during the night. It's a great way to go about it. By the way, a little tip here when it comes to immersion, is to, if you have an extra MP3 player around or an old phone that you don't use anymore, set it up with a charger somewhere in your house and connect it to a speaker and load it with a bunch of Mandarin news or podcasts or just whatever, MP3s of some sort that are playing Mandarin, and just don't turn it off and put it on repeat. So like if there's 1,000 MP3 files, which there's loads on the internet of Mandarin speaking MP3s or podcasts, just put it on somewhere in your house and never turn it off. And you might say, well, what if it is annoying to me? Well, sure. Then turn the volume down to 1 so that you can't hear it. So somebody knocks on the door, you need to open the door, you have a friend over, just turn it down to a level where it won't bother you. And then when your friend leaves or your responsibilities are taken care of and the room becomes silent again, you'll hear it because it's still at level 1 volume. Now, if it was off, you wouldn't hear it and you might not think to turn it back up. But if it's level 1, you hear it and you go back over and just turn it a few more clicks up. Now, we're big advocates of comprehensible input. And of course, at the beginning, turning on Mandarin on a speaker in your house is not going to be comprehensible. But you don't want to say that therefore has no value, because there's something you could learn from it. Maybe you hear a third tone. Maybe you hear a proper qi or ch or something like that, and you can mimic it. You can try to mimic what somebody says at any given point. And what you'll find is that as you continue to go through the Mandarin Blueprint Method, you'll start to notice things that are happening in the immersive speaker, what was coming out of the immersion speaker, as we say. So we'll call it that. We'll call that speaker your immersion speaker. And the reason why you turn it on and never turn it off is because of laziness. You only have to do it once if you do that way. Just go do it and turn it off and forget about it. Set it and forget it. It's great. So it's clearly working to your benefit. So anyway, that's a little tip for immersion. Let's move on to the next question. So the next question comes from MAGDA Jot. What a cool name. I wonder what country she's from. And it says character number 9, qiúhūn, make a movie. This is from a make a movie lesson is where you put all of the elements of the character component, the pinyin, the tone, the pinyin initial and final and tone all together in a mnemonic scene to remember the character and, start to study it in your Anki flashcards. And she picked up on something that I thought she was quite sharp to pick up on. So I'll say her question. She says, "Hi, I have been wondering about Gandalf for G." So Gandalf could potentially represent the letter G because that way you have a person who you can facially recognize very quickly in your mnemonic scene that represents a real aspect of Chinese. So she says, "I've been wondering about Gandalf for G. Somewhere earlier you said that this should be real male actors, or did I get it wrong? In that case, will we be needing Gandalf, male fictitious actor, somewhere along the course later, or can I use him here? Because qiúhūn is GE, and we say this should be a real person." And I'm sure that she noticed that when we gave a scene to represent Gan, which is also should be a male person, we use Gandalf. And of course, a male real person, we use Gandalf, and Gandalf's a fictitious character. And she's right to point out that this is technically a exception to the system. The reason we did that was because the first time you're teaching somebody how this system works, we want to pick an actor, a person to be in the scene that we think is incredibly likely to be known by the most amount of people. Now, there's some people who don't know who Gandalf is, I suppose, out there, but even people who haven't watched Lord of the Rings tend to know who Gandalf is because it's something that's just sort of permeated the culture. However, Magda is right. It's actually not the case that Gandalf should be used for the letter G. Gandalf should actually be used for the letters G, U. Now, it's too complicated to go into here. You'll understand if you go into the course, but effectively we have 4 categories of actor. Real male actors, real female actors, so they're real people in some way. It could be a celebrity, it could be a friend from your life. Fictional characters, and either gods or world leaders, and later we'll talk about another aspect of that, but that they represent the different aspects of the pinyin chart. So the female actors represent the sound E, so anything like ji, qi, xi, ni, ti. These are all going to be represented by female actors. So you can quickly identify, okay, that's a female actor, and it's their name starts with T. It's my friend Teresa, so I know that T is the beginning of this pinyin final. Now, with the U sounds, you've got U, Bu, Pu, Mu, Fu. These different sounds are represented by fictional characters, and one of those is Gu, which is GU, and Gandalf could be a great representation for GU. Now, that said, if you use Gandalf for G and you use another fictional character for GU, you're probably not going to get confused. But I just wanted to point that out, that Magda was quite sharp to pick that up. And then finally, the gods or the world leaders, they represent the U sound. So fictional characters is U, U, and the gods are U, U. And that's a special vowel in Chinese, and there's only 6 of them. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's the answer to your question, Magda. It's technically speaking, no, you should not use Gandalf for G by itself. You should use Gandalf for GU. But if you do use him, it's probably okay. It would just be one exception to the rule that we're following, that you otherwise follow. Okay, now the next question comes from Sydney Green, and this is a great question, and it's great for 2 reasons. So I'm going to address the question directly. Then I'm going to talk about why I knew the answer to the question and why, therefore, these are not actually the type of questions that you need to worry about too much. But here's the question. Why is it 我们这一代很传统 and not 我们的代 很传统. So this comes from character number 90, which is a character dai, which means generation. And it's the lesson is it's a word. So what we're saying is that this character can also be used as a word. And here are a few example sentences. Now, 我们这一代很传统 means our generation is quite traditional. Our generation is traditional. Now, his question is, why is it 我们这一代 as opposed to 我们的代? Because generation in English is a noun, and I could say 我的杯子. This is my glass. I could say, 我的电脑, my computer. So why can't I say 我的代 to mean generation, right? And that's a good question. And the answer is that dai is actually not used as a noun in this context. It's used as a measure word for people. So we all know, if you're a basic level of Chinese, that 一个人 means one person, one individual person. 个, that's actually the character we just talked about with Magda's question. That 个, it's the universal measure word, and it just means individual. And you can say 一个人, 两个人, 三个人, one person, two people, three people. But you could change the measure word, and it would change the meaning of what type of 人, people, you're dealing with. So I could say 一群人, 一群人, and that would mean a group of people, because 群 means group, 一群人 means a group of people. And so 一代人 would mean one generation of people. Now, in this sentence, 我们这一代很传统, this sentence is actually, well, it's leaving out 人 because the context is very clear. But you could say 我们这一代人很传统. So 一个人, 一代人. The only difference is the measure word, but it does change the meaning because 代 means generation. So 一代人 is one generation of people. This is why in Chinese you always have to use measure words, because when it comes to counting numbers, you can't change the form, because in English you could say one person, two people. But in Chinese, you never change the form. It's always 人, and it's always, whatever the other thing is. You can't change the form of the character. And therefore, every kind of counting situation needs to be said with a measure word. Now remember, while it's true that you need to use a measure word every time that you're counting something, even if it's only one, that doesn't mean that in all situations with all nouns you're always counting them. For example, I might just say, do you like coffee? I might say, 你喜欢咖啡吗? Which would just mean, do you like coffee, right? And that's not asking you if you like that particular cup of coffee. It's just saying, in general, do you like coffee? But if I say, would you like a cup of coffee? I might say, 你想喝一杯咖啡吗? 你想喝一杯咖啡吗? Right? Which would mean, would you like to drink a cup of coffee? And that's because it's a cup of coffee, it's 一杯咖啡, right? And that's a difference when it comes to English. In English, we might just say, would you like a coffee? We don't necessarily have to say, would you like a cup of coffee? We have to say, we can just say, would you like a coffee? In Chinese, you can't. If you're going to have any kind of specific number, you need to use that measure word. So there's your explanation as to why 我们这一代很传统 is the correct way to say it. It's because 代 is a measure word. But I'd like to clue you guys in on to how I got that correct. How did I know how to explain that to Sydney? Is it because I have great linguistic knowledge and have studied these grammar points to such a level that I completely understand it? Well, no. It's that I've seen so many sentences and read so many sentences through my time of studying Chinese that I have a database of sort of backlog of sentences I've understood and said and whatever, that I could change the word 代 and switch it out for something else. So 我们这一 something, and realize, oh, 代 is a measure word, because in all these other sentences that are popping into my mind, the thing that is in 代's place is actually a measure word. And then after thinking about that, and it goes, yeah, because 一代人, yeah, sure, that's a generation of people. You could have a group of people. You could have a menagerie. No, menagerie is animals, isn't it? But the point is, when you change the measure word, you can change the meaning, and I realized that. But the reason I realized it wasn't because I studied the grammar point. It's just because I've seen a lot of sentences, and my grammar module, my language module just knows. It just knows that you can't say it the first way because I've never seen it written that way, and that if I say it the way it is and just switch it out for another character, those characters are all measure words. So the ultimate takeaway I'd like you all to get from this is that the fact that I understood how to reverse engineer the answer to that question implies that grammar is like the last thing that you need to learn consciously. And to be honest, you don't even really need to learn it consciously. It's just kind of interesting. You know, when it comes to conscious effort, what your effort should be moving towards is, do I understand, not why do I understand? Because they're two fundamentally different questions. Why do I understand is something that it can be an interesting thing to explore. And if you're a linguist and you really enjoy following that thread, that's awesome. But it's not actually necessary to acquire language. And the proof is in the pudding. You know, my language module just went off, and it just went, I can imagine other characters in this spot. They're all measure words. Oh yeah, okay, so I guess die is a measure word. And then I just thought about it. I was like, yeah, sure. And it's because of the backlog of things I already understand that I could reverse engineer it down. But if you put the cart before the horse and you try to understand how the structure of the sentence is before you've built up that backlog of understandable sentences, then it's just this fact that you now know, but it's not applicable to daily life. So that's the only point I wanted to make about that particular why it is that I knew the answer to that. And hopefully that will serve as a bit of inspiration to remember that your focus each day should be like, how many comprehensible sentences can I get into my eyes and ears by the end of the day? Okay, cool. So next question comes from David Pinkerton, who you might remember from the course. He is one of the people who is in our course, and he in the videos of the Make a Movie videos, and he sent us an email and he says, hey guys, loving the new course and Anki cards. And he took our course before we upgraded our Anki card, so he's glad to see that. Now he says, why do you just show the image for a word rather than image and the meaning when you're reviewing cards? Is there a reason, like it helps to recall or something? So what he's referring to is the word connection reviews. So there are review cards for character components, for characters, for the actors like Gandalf, who represent your pinyin initial, for your sets, which represent the pinyin final or vowel sound. And there's also flashcards for vocabulary. So 2 characters that you've learned that create a new word. And there's 2 types of cards. One card has the Chinese on the front, and you're supposed to remember how to pronounce it and what the meaning is. And then there's another one where the image is on the front, and that's it. There's just an image on the front. And what you're supposed to do is produce the word, essentially. That's all you really need to do, is just produce the word, because what you're doing there is connecting a visual image, which again, our visual cortex is about half of our brain. So connecting the visual representation of the word, and maybe even a past experience that you've had with the word, and saying it in Chinese first of all, it takes out the English. There's no English in it. It's just image, word, image connection, right? And David's asking, what about the meaning? Well, the meaning is kind of larger than the English translation. So take, for example, when you're making a vocabulary flashcard, which is something that we teach you how to do in phase 2, we teach you how to install a little Google image search in Anki and do it right on the spot. It's quite quick. When you're making that image search, you want that image to represent what that meaning is to you. And the fact that you just see the image and then what you have to do is produce the Chinese word means that you're taking out the English, you're going directly to what you want, which is an image connected to language. A visual connection that goes directly to language. And so that's why we do it that way. And it's also important to remember that they're called comprehension cards and production cards. So the comprehension is like, you learned this, here's the character. Do you remember learning it? What did it mean again? Recall it here, right? So that's, did you comprehend it? But producing it is like, Here's the visual representation of this, which is how we represent almost everything in our minds. Here's the visual representation of it. Produce it. Produce the word that is what this is. It's not as much of a comprehension as much as a production. And so the production card, I think, is actually more important. The same thing with the character cards. I think the production card is more important. When you see the English on the front and then you're supposed to write the character, you're supposed to produce the character. That, I think, is a little bit more effective in helping your recall. But remember, what SRS does for you is it allows these facts that you've learned before to kind of swim around your unconscious, and then you fish hook them back. You recall them as opposed to just rote learning. And that's the beauty of SRS. So that's the reason. I hope that's clear enough as to why we have those two types of cards. So the next question comes from Robert Carver. He asked the question on the character number 121, ji, make a movie. And ji means self or oneself, and it's used most often in the character 自己, which means myself. So 我自己 is myself. Now, when you're learning the character, there is a new prop introduced, which we call a box. And it's basically, of course you can always see this in the show notes, but it's essentially a 3-sided square with one bit open. And Robert says, confusing directions here. If it's a box and a hook, then the box is facing the wrong way, even though you specifically say to remember the box is facing the other way. And this is just, I clarified this in the text of the lesson, but whether or not the empty space of the 3-sided square is facing left or right, what we're just saying is that try to imagine in your mind that the open part of the box is facing either left or right based on what it actually is in the character. We weren't trying to say it's always one way or the other. So sometimes a prop might switch positions like that. And really what it comes down to is, are we going to tell you to learn an entirely new visual representation of this character component, aka a prop? Are we going to tell you to learn an entirely new prop just because it flipped? Seems unnecessary. You can just imagine in your mind that the box flips. So that's the only reason behind that. I did clarify that in the notes for the lesson, and so I just wanted to make it clear that that's awesome when people give that type of feedback, because any of those sort of clerical things or things that are unclear, it just helps make the course better for everyone. So appreciate that, Robert. Now, next, 2 characters later, this character 123, which is E. And Eric Brown says, whoa, so close to G, the character we just talked about. At least a different actor pronunciation. And so if you look in the show notes, you'll see these 2 characters are very similar. The only real difference is that G, the open space in the box and then the hook below it, connect directly. And then with E, that's the character 123, the box goes a little bit down. So we'll have a visualization right here of it, but you can see that the difference is very slight. So Eric says, at least a different actor pronunciation. I made part of my scene, my actor fixing my 2 props by pushing the hook higher to try and remember the distinction. But Eric makes a good point here, which is that the 2 characters have a different pronunciation. The one is Ji and the other one is E, right? So the fact that they have that different pronunciation means that you're going to have a different actor in the scene. And so that is very visually distinct. So for Ji, for me, that was Jennifer Aniston, because females represent that E sound. And then E was Yoko Ono. And so the fact that Yoko Ono is there and not Jennifer Aniston is a distinct enough difference that I'm likely to remember the difference between the scene. And also the other thing is they don't mean the same thing. So Ji means myself or oneself, and then E means already. Right, so those are very different meanings. And the fact that you don't have to remember the same, like you're going to remember it with 2 different actors, is visually distinct enough that you're unlikely to confuse them later. But Eric did do a good thing, which he says, okay, the props are the same though. The only difference is the positioning of the props. So I'm going to move the hook and the box up in some way to create the distinction. And that's good. But the other thing I would say about this is that every person who learns Chinese has to deal with this, the fact that 自己的己 and 已经的已 are very similar, but you get it. It's no problem. You'll get it after not very long at all. Okay, so next we have an email from Gary. And I liked this email. It was kind of interesting. So he says, "Good morning. I do apologize if you have covered this already because I will be starting the course today. But is there a distinction between how one would say car and to eat? CHE versus CHI." And so car is ch and eat is ch. Okay? And the difference here is that CHE has the simple final E in it. And the simple final E is a very distinct and kind of a little bit difficult simple final, but we do cover it in Unit 2 of our pronunciation mastery, which is It's a diphthong, so there's two sounds. You got the Actually, you see my throat, but your mouth doesn't move at all. Versus ch. So I'm sure you can hear that clear difference. So ch, to eat, tu means car. So I can see how to a beginner's ears they might sound very similar, but once you really understand how to articulate simple final E, you'll see they're quite different. Now, we also have a couple of videos on this on our YouTube channel in the Pronunciation Mastery playlist, so feel free to check that out. There's a bit of free content there, and of course, it's in Unit 2 of the actual course. Now, Gary has another question. He says, "Also curious about how specialized your hearing is compared to an average person. When you listen to the viral clip of Yanny versus Laurel, which sound did you hear?" So I left the link in the show notes for this. And, probably all of you have heard of it before, where there was this recording and some people heard Yanny and some people heard Laurel. And I heard Yanny when I did it, but I'm not sure why. I have no idea. I mean, it's something to do with like the frequencies, and Yanny is higher frequencies. And then there's another one which I had not heard of before, which is a viral clip of Grover from Sesame Street, where only some people hear him saying, "That's really awesome," and other people hear him say, "That's really effing awesome." And I would imagine that part of the brain that differentiates sounds is more specialized in a bilingual person who mastered a tough language like Mandarin. Well, because I've never seen the Grover clip until I watched it, I did link it in the show notes. I did hear the effing in there, but I can't help but think that I was primed to hear it. You know, that's a genuine psychological phenomenon where if you're primed to hear something, you will sometimes hear it as opposed to not. So it's that same sort of thing of you can't unsee something. So like if you have one of those pictures where if you look at it one way, it's like a beautiful young woman, but if you look at it another way, it's an older lady. Many times I look at it and I only see one of them, but then once I see the new one, I can't unsee it. I see the pattern now, and I've made the connection. So priming is genuinely a thing, and I did hear the effing in there, but who knows whether that's because I've learned Mandarin and become better at differentiating things. I mean, I am a musician, so music does require I'm a drummer in a jazz band, and so of course that is a very conversational music because it's largely improvisational, and so you have to listen to what the other musicians are doing in order to participate in the conversation in a way that is, acceptable and makes them want to play with you again. And that, I'm sure, has helped my hearing, but I don't think all of it transfers to Mandarin because, I certainly struggled to understand certain things for a long time, and getting certain tones down and whatever. I wish I'd had all the techniques that we had in pronunciation mastery when I first started. It would have helped a lot. But as for whether or not learning this second language does make it easier to differentiate, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, but I can't say with any real certainty. I haven't noticed any subjective anecdotal experience that tells me, oh, after I learned Mandarin, my ability to differentiate between sounds got stronger. So I know it's probably a little bit of a disappointing answer, but that's the best I can do, I'm afraid. So next, we have the scene from Ryan Smith. So this is him sharing a scene that he came up with, and he's shared a lot of scenes with us, which we always really appreciate. And this is for character number 30. And when I say a scene, by the way, I mean combining the visual representations of the character components, the visual representation of the pinyin initial, which we'll call an actor, the representation of the pinyin final, which we'll call a set, and how they all, the props, actor, and set, interact with each other to create the meaning of the character. Now, what's the meaning of the character? Well, this is character number 30, ma, which means to scold someone. And so you can see the character in the show notes, but it's essentially two mouths right above a horse. And so the location is his friend Anil's bathroom. Now, why is it Anil? Because ma ends in A, and so Anil is his friend. Anil's bathroom is fourth tone. So it's A, fourth tone. So the A in Anil makes a connection to the letter A, and then the bathroom, all bathrooms represent fourth tone. And he has a friend named Marcos who represents the M. So suppose he was in Anil's bathroom with a friend named Paul. Well, that would mean the pronunciation would be pa, but he's with his friend Marcos, so the pronunciation is ma. Now, again, his props to represent those two mouths are those two Rolling Stones mouths from the cover of the Rolling Stones album, and he has a horse as the bottom part. You can just imagine really almost any horse. So here's what Ryan says about the scene. In the previous scene, Sniffles the Looney Tune drove Marcos to dive off the 12th story balcony by annoying him with too many questions. So in the previous scene was the scene where he learned ma, which means yes or no, which is actually a Rolling Stones mouth on the left and a horse on the right, but it's also fifth tone. And so he's connecting because it's going to be Marcos again. It's going to be Anil's house again. So he's connecting the previous scene to this scene, which is a technique that there aren't a lot of opportunities to do in the system, but it does happen from time to time. Now, he says, Sniffles the Looney Tune drove Marcos to dive off the 12th story balcony by annoying him with too many questions. Well, in this scene, Marcos is in the bathroom with the horse, trying to nurse the horse back to health due to his massive fall. So again, he connects the two scenes. And what happened in the previous scene? Well, it's continued on into this scene. Continuing. The Rolling Stone mouth that Sniffles split off to ask more questions is in the bathroom scolding Marcos for jumping off the balcony with the horse. The scolding is so severe and the Rolling Stone mouth so mad that the camera does a split shot, highlighting the Rolling Stone mouth on the top right and top left of the two side-by-side shots, one highlighting the injured horse and the other highlighting the ashamed Marcos. I went with the split screenshot for this because while slightly difficult to mentally picture, it was the only way that I could really get across to my head that we need to really emphasize the duality of the Rolling Stone mouth prop. And I think that that's a good way to go about it, Ryan. I do think that if you just imagined two Rolling Stone mouth props above the horse, that would probably be good enough. But I like the way that Ryan is thinking because what he's trying to do is say, okay, well, it's my brain and I'm just imagining things. So why not just imagine a split screen? You could totally do that. Like that's a simple special effect that many people do when many directors use and many editors use in movies or TV shows. And so why not? It's just your imagination. Just imagine a split screen. So I like what he's doing there. I like that he's trying to get across the connection from the previous scene because the previous scene was also MA, so it was also Marcos in Anil's house. And so now it's MA, but it's a fourth tone, so we switch to the bathroom. And, as you can see, it's very connected. And, of course, also in the previous scene, there was one Rolling Stones mouth and a horse. Now there's two Rolling Stones mouth and a horse. So there's a lot of similarity, but luckily, because the way they interact is so different, we know that, okay, this character means to scold. Next, we also have from Ryan Smith a comment on the pick a prop lesson for bai, which means 100. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this phenomenon of pick a prop, what happens sometimes is that you learn a character like the character for 100 bai. And right after that, we'll have a lesson that says, hey, you need to pick a prop to represent this entire character. Why? Because later, there are going to be slightly more complicated characters that have this entire character in it. So a good example of this is the character Zhen is a simple character with just two strokes that means person. At character 7, you learn Zhen, and then I can't remember exactly what character is, maybe character 25 or 6 maybe, you learn Zhen, which means to recognize. something. And so that character is the left side component means speech, and the right side character is the entire character zhen, right? So after you finish learning zhen, we'll say, hey, later there's going to be several more complicated characters that use this. So you need to pick an object to represent it. And so similarly, that's what Ryan Smith is doing here when he is picking a prop to represent the entire character by. Now, when you pick a prop, you want to think about, well, what did the original character mean? Well, it means 100. So our original suggestion was to use Ben Franklin or maybe a $100 note because he's the guy on the $100 American note. And we gave a couple of other suggestions as well. But Ryan says the main thing that comes to mind for him as a physical representation of 100 is, and I'm going to butcher this word, but he says, is the hecatonchires. Hecatonchires? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's a Cheires at the end. But they are the 100-handed ones from Greek mythology. Definitely stands out in scenes anyway. And so I love this because I've never studied Greek mythology to that level of depth, and I had never heard of these. But if you have, use them, because that sounds really very, very, visually distinct. So imagine any scene that has 100 in it like that. You imagine those Greek mythological hecatonchires, and you got it. You'll definitely know, okay, I have to write that entire character for 100 as a part of this scene. Okay, awesome. Next question, again from NASEEM. He says, hello, I'm a bit confused. I learned in the pronunciation course that 今天 means today. Which should I use, 今 or 今天? And he's asking this question in the Mandarin Blueprint Method, which is, of course, a separate course from the pronunciation mastery. And he's asking this when he learns the character 今, because of course, 今天 is a 2-character word. And so what I would say to NASEEM is that not all Chinese characters are also words. So some characters are just what are called a morpheme, which is like a little mini meaning. It's kind of like the ed in succeeded or the ing in succeeding, right? It has meaning. It does definitely matter. The jin being in 今天 is important, but you can't just use 今 by itself. So when we say the meaning of the character is today, what we're saying is that it has a mini meaning, but it still needs to be combined with other characters in order for it to be a word. And the way you can tell this is that in our course, when we say that a word is, when we say that a character is a word, we'll have a lesson about it. We'll say it's a word. And that means you can use this character by itself. But if you can't use the character by itself, there will not be an it's a word lesson. You'll have to wait until there's another character you've learned that can combine with it to create a 2-character word. So that's how that works. And also, just as a note about jin, we gave it a keyword of today because the most common word that jin is used in is 今天. Now, it's used in several different words, but it actually kind of means current, like current, happening now, the now thing, right? But there's other characters that mean now, and we also thought, okay, when you're learning a character at the very beginning, you want to learn its most basic meaning first, and then learning the later meanings when you already know its components, you already know its tone, you already know its pronunciation. If there's a more specified meaning you can have, then go for that, right? Because people who will be more advanced in Chinese might, nitpick with us and go, well, saying that jin means today isn't really correct because you could say 今年, which means this year, which isn't necessarily referring to today. But the problem is that if you're starting off and you see a keyword like current or in the present time period, it's a little bit too abstract. Sometimes you just want to get to the main meaning, and then later when you know more, you'll be like, oh, okay, I can expand this out into a larger purview. Because that's how learning works. You cannot learn things that are too far outside of what you can understand. So we always want to start off with, those types of things. Now, next, we have something from another comment from Ryan Smith, and I really like this one. So I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that the 4 different types of actors that you can have are real males, whether they're, celebrities or people from your life, real females, in other words, non-fictional, fictional characters, and either world leaders or gods. But I also mentioned that the world leaders and gods represent yu, and because there are so few syllables in Chinese, there's only 20 total syllables and only 6 sort of beginnings. You've got yu, nu, lu, ju, chu, shu. Because there's only 6 starting points, that means that there's only 6 actors to pick. And so we recommend either world leaders, so you can make chu, you can make that Donald Trump if you wanted to, or you could pick gods. So obviously Ryan's into mythical Greek mythology, so maybe he'll pick Aphrodite and Zeus and things like that. But he said, being a big Star Wars fan, I decided to go down that route for the yu actors. And you might say, well, aren't the Star Wars actors fictional characters? And it's like, yes, they are. I mean, so are the mythical gods. But the fact that they are categorically distinct, the only rule would be don't use Star Wars characters for your fictional characters. So like for the oo sounds, like oo, boo, poo, moo, foo, this whole section, don't use Star Wars characters and then you're fine, right? So what he did was yu is Yoda, nu is Newt Gunray, Lu is Princess Leia, Ju is Jabba the Hutt, Chu is Qui-Gon Jinn because his name also starts with Q, and then Shu is Aayla Secura. So he is more of a Star Wars fan than I am because I don't know who Newt Gunray and Aayla Secura are, but I know the other ones, and that's great. So let's see. He said a few more things here. He said, there are some possible points of confusion that might happen since I'd already picked Obi-Wan as the prop for Zhi and Christopher Lee as my C actor, but I don't think that Obi-Wan as the prop should be an actual problem since he'll always appear with an actual actor, and Christopher Lee should be fine since I already have him firmly in my mind as the actor himself, not as Count Dooku persona. It helps that I grew up watching him as Dracula, and he's right. So Christopher Lee is the actor who happened to play a Star Wars character at some point, so if you're not imagining him as a Star Wars character, there's really no conflict. You're imagining the actor, Christopher Lee. And then in the case of Obi-Wan being the prop for Zhi, because you can have a prop be a person too, if the meaning of the prop is like very clear. So he actually said that about that before. When Zhi is pronounced in third tone and means only, that made Ryan think of help us, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're our only hope from Star Wars A New Hope. And so that made him think of Obi-Wan, and so Obi-Wan is his representation of Zhi as a prop. And that's perfectly clear representation. There's no problem with that. And so in other words, props can be people too. But the fact that Obi-Wan Kenobi is representing a character component and not representing opinion initial means that you're not going to have a problem. So I love this. This is thinking in the right way. It's categorical thinking. So he's thinking in that way, and, it's moving on from there. Okay, so a few more questions here. So we have from the email, Deborah, I love the podcast. I started your course a few weeks ago. I had been looking online for a month or longer for a course that made sense to me. Your approach is brilliant, and your blueprint method and materials are excellent. I am greatly enjoying the lessons. I'm doing it all on an iPhone, as I've been traveling for 6 years now and have no home or computer. So far, it's working well, although a bit of a headache with Anki was necessary, but it now runs only off the iPhone. Not bad for a 64-year-old woman. With age comes patience. And, I really appreciated this email for a number of reasons. First of all, Anki is, it is the part of the course that, Anki is simultaneously awesome. We love that it exists and it's so customizable, but it is the biggest headache of the course for us and for our clients because the user interface is not very user-friendly. And it's got so many areas where it can be confusing, and we'd love to get an integration of a spaced repetition software directly into our course, but we've looked into it and it's quite an expensive endeavor, so we'll have to get more funding in some way to do that. But, hopefully we'll just keep selling the course. So, hey, share with your friends the Mandarin Blueprint course, and maybe we can add an SRS to the system. But it is a bit frustrating. But what I liked about this is, first of all, she didn't make excuses, right? She just figured it out. And what's going to happen, the fact that she figured out how to do it on her iPhone, even though I'm sure it was a bit of a headache at the beginning, now she's done it. And so many things with this process are you do it once and then it's done, right? And then you just have it set in place. So this is all just to say that while Anki can sometimes be a bit of a pain, remember that the overall goal is that it's going to give you a perfectly awesome system for remembering everything that you have learned, and it's going to provide you with a means to not worry about whether or not you're going to remember things. So even though it can be technically sometimes frustrating at the beginning, it's worth it. It's well worth it to go through. And we did try to do our best on making things very clear in the Anki tutorials, but if ever something is not clear, we'll make sure that we address it. And actually, in a couple of questions, I'll address a little bit more about Anki. But, the other thing that I've come to realize about this course is that it is not at all limited based on being older. So if you're somebody who has the opinion that I'm too old to learn Chinese, I would suggest that no, you're not. Actually, being older really supports this system because you have more experiences to glean from. The more experiences you have to glean from, the more chance that something that we suggest in the course rings a bell in your mind and makes you go, oh, yeah, that prop, I can represent that with this experience I had when I was 45, right? And so a 30-year-old or 31-year-old like myself won't be able to do that because I just haven't built up enough experiences yet. But for younger people, don't worry. Like, you'll still be able to make the connections because, well, first of all, sure, you're younger and you might be a little bit more energy filled and have a bit more of a, quick reaction to things. And also, I mean, when it comes down to it, there are so many things like that you could choose to represent the character components, to represent the actors and sets. And there's so much flexibility in this method that you would have to be really young to not have enough experiences. So, okay, next from the email. This is also from Chad Wrestler. Hey guys, burning through the pronunciation mastery course and loving it. As a student, I was thinking about how I would enjoy seeing my instructors in real life situations. Is there any chance of a Chinese on the street type of video where we could see you guys engaging in regular conversations? I had almost paid for a different service, but it was Luke's video where he was speaking Chinese that made me hesitate. Research the Mandarin Blueprint more and then decide to invest in it. Parentheses, best decision. Thanks, Chad. Just a thought from a student. Have a good one. This is something that Luke and I have been talking about for a while, and it's just a bit tricky to set up because in order to do it properly, it's very time consuming. And of course, we have been producing the course all this time, and we're going to be potentially expanding it out a bit more. I was thinking that maybe, and you guys can let me know what you think of this. I was thinking of maybe setting up a camera and a little sign in the park and just sort of talking about a topic, but then if anybody comes over to chat with them and see what we can come up with for a lesson out of it. But it's a bit tricky because when it comes to lesson planning, you can't really plan that with a random person you meet in the street, but you can get some really genuine Chinese. So it's a bit of a, if we did it, it would all be free content, likely just to help people know that Mandarin Blueprint exists. But on the other hand, it's definitely something we're going to address. It's a bit tricky, when you think about what goes into that type of plan, there's a significant amount of work that would have to go into building that type of system, but we're interested in doing it. It's definitely something that could be quite fun. I can say this. I was thinking about having Annie, our grammar instructor and sort of the person who's been helping us out with these grammar materials, come on the podcast and we could just have a conversation in Chinese. Be more than happy to do that. I used to do a podcast in Chinese, actually, and it would be nice to bring that back. So, all right. Final question of today, and this is kind of a twofold question. So the first one is about Anki, and so I'm going to give a practical bit of advice from it, and the second one is a bit more of a mentality thing. So this is from Keith, and he says, as I go through your program, I only started last week, I was interested in your thoughts on these things. The first, Anki. I have read through the whole guide, downloaded the program on my computer, have had some experience with practicing with the cards that I have made with my editing inputs, but still some things about this program befuddle me. Well, I understand, Keith. It's not exactly the clearest program. Notwithstanding that the UI on the desktop version is just clunky and seems like it is from the 80s, tell me about it. I don't get exactly how it works with the option of introducing new cards / new cards per day, etc. I understand why you would need to double the number of new cards of the videos you watch that day, but translating this to apply to the Anki deck seems too difficult. I just got so frustrated with trying to understand that side of it. I just waited until I was all the way through with levels 1 through 3 videos and then studied the deck as a whole. I understand they are sorted by the do column, but some in the column had dates and some of them had numbers, 12, 13, etc., which confused me even more. Am I the only one that has found it this way? Well, I highly doubt it, Keith, because Anki can be confusing, but I'll give you a couple of practical points at this when we start off. So when you get the brand new first Anki deck, whether it's pronunciation mastery or it's from the Mandarin Blueprint Method, before you've done any reviews, if you look at the column for do, they're just going to be numbers, like you said, 12, 13, etc., 1, 2, 3, 4. But as soon as they enter into your review queue, you look at it for the first time and you study the card, well, then it does have a due date because that column is sorted by due date, right? So if it doesn't have a due date yet, it'll just be given a number in the queue. And it's just saying this number will come next. But as soon as it enters your review cycle, then of course it'll have a due date at that point. So that's the first thing that might have been a bit confusing about that. And that sometimes is not something that's clear to people. Now, next, when it comes to knowing how many cards to add, what we offered as a solution to the question of how many cards should you do each day? Because suppose that you just set it to automatically show you 20 new cards per day. Well, what if you did more than 20 cards worth of lessons that day in the course? How do you see all the cards you did that day? And one of the solutions is to set the new cards per day at 0 and use this function called custom study, and you just add the amount of new cards that you're going to do today based on what you did in the course. But there's another thing you can do, and this might be a little bit easier. It's a bit more manual to do it this way, but what you would do is you would go to your deck in Browse. So you're in Browse in Anki, you select any card and then hit Control-A to select all cards. And then you would want to deselect any cards that are already in your review cycle. So those in the do column that have a date, deselect those, but select all the cards that have not yet entered your review cycle. Then, after they're selected, you would want to hit suspend, which if you right-click on Anki 2.1, you can hit suspend, or if it's Anki 2.0, you can just click the suspend button at the top. And this will cause all of the rows that represent the various cards to turn yellow, and there will be a parenthesis around the do number. Now, this means they won't go into your review queue, and what you just simply do is after you finish a study session, you go into Anki, go into Browse, and select the specific cards that you learned that day, and then just click the suspend button again, which will unsuspend them. And now they're ready to enter your review queue. And if you do it this way, you can set your new cards per day to some really high number. Just set it to like 1,000 or whatever, because they're all suspended. So if a card is suspended, it will not go into your new card queue regardless of what your new cards per day are. And if it's set to 1,000 and then you unsuspend 20 cards, well, those 20 cards will immediately become available to review. So just to go through it one more time, you select all cards that have not already entered your review cycle. So if they have a date, don't select those, but you select all cards that have not entered your review cycle. You hit suspend to make sure they won't go into your queue. And then after you learn whatever you learned that day, if you learned from 10 videos that represent 10 Anki cards, you go into Browse again, select those specific cards, and unsuspend them. And you want to just make sure that in your settings, your new cards per day is set to something other than 0. Because if it's still set at 0, then still nothing will show up. But if you set it to like 1,000 or whatever, then it will be no problem. So that's another solution for unsuspending your cards. And I would do it this way, Keith, because waiting until the end is something that won't put you into the review cycle of the things you actually did that day. And that's really helpful to do that. You want to do that as soon as you can. Okay, now Keith had another question that I thought was a bit more applicable to everybody here, in the sense that this is a mentality that I understand, but I think it's a little bit off. So we'll talk about it here. He says, the other thing, your method makes total logical sense to me, and I'm enjoying going through the program and reliving some sets and actors from my past. However, as I work through the cards and get to the characters, I find myself wondering, how the heck am I going to keep hundreds and hundreds of them straight in my head when I get to that point? Sometimes I struggle to recall and think, okay, now what was that movie scene I made with that actor? Was it that set, or those prompts, or that keyword, etc.? If I'm struggling to keep all that stuff straight in my head in levels 1 through 3, what about much later in the course? Having said that, you guys have done an amazing job with the course. I can't even imagine the hours and hours you've put into making it look so professional. Well done. Well, thank you for that compliment there at the end, Keith. And while I completely understand this mentality, it's actually a little bit off base, because what happens as you go further into the course is that you get better at every aspect of what you said. You get better at quickly recognizing your actor. You get better at quickly recognizing your props. You get better at just knowing what to do when making a new scene so that it's more memorable. So really at the beginning is when you're the worst at it. So it's not that surprising that you would struggle to keep it straight in your head what to do. And that's why at the beginning there's no rush. Take your time with each character, because the fact that you take your time with each character means that later you'll get how the system works. So I often say to people that it's about a 7 or 8 step process to learn each character. Now, a 7 or 8 step process is not clear at the beginning. You have to really think about it, right? But how many times do you have to do a 7 or 8 step process before you got it? Okay, I got this 7 or 8 step process. 30 times? 40 times? Well, that's the kind of feedback we get from people, is that, oh yeah, it was around character 30 or 40 that I really started to get how the method works, and at that point I could just go way faster. So while I understand the feeling of like, isn't this just going to get more complicated as I go forward? It's like, well, no, actually, you're just going to get better at it as you go forward. And that's where we're going to end today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. As a reminder, you can check out the Pronunciation Mastery course, the Mandarin Blueprint Method course, in the show notes. And podcast listeners, you are going to be a part of the Spring Festival Special, which is still going to go until February 20th. So that is 20% off any of the offers that we have available for the Mandarin Blueprint Method. So whether it's the $30 a month, that goes down to $24 a month, and that's a monthly payment, or the $15 a month option goes down to $12 a month, and that's a biannual payment. And of course, this also applies to our lifetime offer, which is both the Pronunciation Mastery and the Mandarin Blueprint Method, which means you save $100 because it's $500 usually. 20% off brings it down to $400. So $399. So anyway, that's all for today. They've got the new webinars coming out. We got new stuff. Any feedback that you want to give us, you can either leave a comment on the course or you can message us at support@mandarinblueprint.com. And hey, I understand that iTunes reviews of podcasts are very helpful. So if you find this podcast helpful and would like to leave us a review or send us any kind of testimonial to our email, we would really appreciate that. We're really trying to get the word out about how excellently effective the Mandarin Blueprint Method is for helping people get to Mandarin fluency and literacy faster than was ever possible before. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.